Hey there, Serger here. In this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how to sew a French seam. A French seam is an elevated seam finish used in higher-end garments. It completely encases the raw edges, adding durability to your clothing. The best part, there's no need for any fancy machines. You'll just need a regular sewing machine and a pair of scissors. Let's get started. When sewing a French seam, you can follow the basic sewing instructions that come with your pattern. You'll just need to add a couple of extra steps. First, you'll sew the fabric together with the wrong sides together. Typically, patterns have you sew pieces together with the right sides together, but for a French seam, you'll start with the wrong sides together. When it comes to actually sewing, you'll want to cut the seam allowance in half. For example, if the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch, you'll want to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance while sewing. Once the seam is sewn, trim the seam allowance. I usually trim the seam allowance by about half. So in this case, I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance and I'm cutting it down to an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, press the seam to one side. Then, fold the fabric along the seam so the right sides are now together. Press the seam so it's crisp. You'll be sewing along this seam, encasing the raw edges. Using the other half of the seam allowance, sew along the seam. In this case, I'll be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance since that's half of the 1/2 inch seam allowance this particular pattern calls for. You'll be encasing the raw edges. Turn the fabric right side out and finish by pressing the seam allowance to one side. Happy sewing!